Welcome to Stories from the Road. I'm your host, Adalbert Boffin, halfling culinary chronicler extraordinaire. And let me tell you about some of the most memorable meals I've had in my time. Today's topic is feasts. The road taught me long ago that not all feasts are happy occasions. Some are quiet as snowfall, some taste of smoke and farewells, but every one of them feeds more than just the body. A feast is a story told through communion. The merry tables teach you how to share, and the solemn ones teach you what sharing really costs. So let me tell you about the most difficult feast I've ever had the honor of attending. I first met my old buddy on a job I had taken many years ago. While I've never formally been an adventurer, I've helped with supply management and have been a porter for a few parties in my years. This time, the job was simple. Take out a baby black dragon who had been fouling the head of a river which fed into local glades. I say simple, but simple isn't always easy. Thankfully, I wasn't on combat duty. I was tagging along with a lively company who knew their way around a fight. 2 bright swordsmen, a priestess with a cool head, and a ranger who could read moss like a map. The 4 of them moved like a well-oiled machine, and I never once felt worried for my own skin in their presence. Safe to say, they successfully dispatched the source of the blight. I'll spare you the details of the fight because the really interesting part is what came after. The death of a black dragon, even a baby one, is an ending for the beast and a beginning for the restoration process of all the land that it blighted. The beast's acid hangs on like a stubborn fever. Ferns crisp at the edges, fish lie still in the shallows, and the stream carries a sourness that you can smell in the air. My companions wiped their blades clean after the kill, and immediately started making their way back to the city to collect their coin without so much as giving the land a second look. On the path out of the glaive, I met a conclave of druids with blighted bark in their hair and worry in their eyes. They asked me for help, or just for any hands available. For stone to slow the current, for brush to weave into fences, or even just for someone to mind the fire while they boiled water and brewed poultices for burned feet. The party wished them luck and moved on. Not our contract, not our problem, the ranger said. And he was right. It just wasn't my kind of right. I decided to stay around, and I asked the party to leave my share with the tavern keep for whenever I got back into town. They obliged. No hard feelings to them. Adventurers tend to hurry from one place to another. But I'm happy to take my time. I got to work helping the druids however I could. I'm far from the strongest, but eager hands are a vital resource in times of crisis. We began with the riverbanks. We cut willow and hazel and wove them into low hurdles to keep the soil from running, pegging them in with green wood stakes. We shoveled charcoal from last winter's burn and packed it with clean gravel into long, shallow filter beds that knelt beside the stream like dark loaves of bread. A wagon from an upstream quarry brought sacks of crushed chalk, and we dusted it into the streams in handfuls so that we wouldn't shock the water. I cooked between errands, making clear broth with leeks, oat porridge, and a bit of nettle tea. Nothing extravagant, but a welcome reprieve for the wearied workers. When the ash cooled, we sifted it and mixed a whisper into the worst seeps where the dragon's breath had eaten the stone to pits. None of this dirty work made for a story worth singing about, but day by day, it did make the water sting less and clear up little by little. On the 3rd morning, with the sun still soft, I knelt at a bend where flat stones made the stream quiet and polished a lens with willow ash to see whether the water had begun to improve. That was when he stepped out of the trees, a real-life unicorn, and the first I had ever seen. His hooves set down as if the ground had asked permission first. He was not the shining tale book sort, so much as the kind of brightness you notice after a storm. His horn was pale with a thin ash-gray ring near its base where the blight had breathed on him. His mane carried a few burrs, and his coat was clean, but not spotless due to his own work in the grove. His eyes were the color of a sky trying to clear after rain. He moved to the filter hurdles that we had woven, tested them with a forehoof, and listened to them creak to judge our work. He didn't speak like a person speaks. Meaning arrived the way heat arrives from a good fire, steady and undeniable, directly to your core. I set a clay cup of clear broth on the broad stone, and he lowered his head, letting the steam curl around his breath without drinking, which is apparently a way of showing thanks in this grove. After giving thanks, he lapped up the broth, and before he turned away, he gave me a name I could carry beyond these trees. Ezekiel. It wasn't the oldest word the grove has for him that he made me understand, but it was the one that village children used, and the one that I could pronounce much easier than his true name. After he bade me farewell, I continued on my work, and the days flew past. On the 10th day, it turned out the thing the grove needed most from me was not just another pair of hands with a shovel, but a cook who understood dragon acid. By this point, the water had mostly cleared, and it seemed to be safe for consumption. People had begun to drink from the stream again to no ill effect. But that morning, an unexpected shift in the wind pushed a pocket of black water out of a back eddy, and before anyone noticed, Ezekiel drank from the stream. He immediately staggered like a lamp in a gust, foam bright at his lips, breath rasping. The druids reached for spells and poultices that worked on skin and flesh, but dragon sour burns from the inside. I shouted for a clay pot, clean bones, chalk, and both mallow root and angelica root. And then I set the smallest fire that I could keep steady. What saves a throat is different than what saves flesh or skin. It's important to prioritize softness before strength for this kind of remedy making. I cracked the bones and coaxed a quick, clear stalk, skimming until the surface shone. I pounded chalk into powder and whisked it in a pinch at a time, and then I added the crushed mallow and angelica and let it whisper at the edge of a simmer until the root sap bloomed. When it coated the back of a spoon like silk, I strained it through clean linen into a warm bowl. Rill, an apprentice groundskeeper, steadied Ezekiel's jaw, and I tipped the broth forward a mouthful at a time. Slowly but surely, his breath eased by degrees. The panic left his eyes, and when he finally lowered his head to the bowl on his own, the whole glade exhaled with him. We made more and filled clay flasks for the night, just in case anyone else was to suffer the affliction. And by morning, Ezekiel was taking water again without flinching. The druids tasted the drench with caution, and then copied the method into their ledger in neat, serious script. Dragon burn cordial, for throats and bellies when acid runs in the streams. As they wrote it down, they told me the importance of the conclave ledger. This was no mere notebook. It was a collection of knowledge for the entire grove, noting remedies, important dates to keep in mind, tasks to complete, and tasks that have been finished. The ledger was almost akin to a holy book for them, and only Ezekiel or the head warden could add to it. As they told me the book's importance, children wove garlands from grass and flowers to place on Ezekiel as he rested. I learned not to doubt the efficacy of children's wishes, because Ezekiel was quickly able to stand again on his own, legs unsteady like a baby fawn, but his strength returned over the course of a few hours, and he joined while I showed Rill and the druids how to judge when the broth had gone from thin to silk without ever reaching a boil. Then he touched his horn to the rim of the clay pot when we were done. That was how I knew I had been useful in the way that matters here. Spells have their time, of course, but sometimes a warm bowl made from the bounty of the woods and the right patience are the difference between a fatal wound and a story you live to tell. The days after Ezekiel's sickness settled into the kind of work you feel nostalgic for after it's done. We tightened the willow hurdles where the current worried them, swapped out filter beds gone black with what corruption they'd caught, and remade a bridge that had been dissolved in the dragon's acid just a few weeks prior. Ezekiel kept near without crowding, testing our work with his hoof, and when the apprentices flagged, I set a small pot to a whisper and passed around clear broth along with oatcakes and slices of apple they dried in the fall sun. The food didn't fix the water, but it fixed the people fixing the water, which amounts to the same thing over time. I learned Ezekiel's roots and he learned my rhythms. He would appear at the bend just when I had stopped looking for him, stand where the bank held firm, and watch me polish a lens until it told the truth. If he nosed the clay pot, it meant I'd forgotten to drink my own cup. If he flicked his ear toward the meadows, it meant I was trying to hurry something that needed to be slow. And while he could always talk to me telepathically, he seemed a unicorn of few words and many actions. In the evenings, we wrote into the ledger together, detailing what we'd mended, what we'd learned, and what should be done next so that the next pair of hands wouldn't start with confusion. When the worst of the dragon's sting had passed through the water, and the fish began testing the streams again, the druids told me I could go with their thanks. But I found reasons not to. I patched the footbridge a second time even though it didn't need it. I resorted the tools and rations in my kit until they were tidy enough for inspection. I volunteered to sit the night fire even when my eyes felt full of sand. Every hour I stole from departure felt like one more stitch holding the grove together. And every hour also felt a little dishonest. Ezekiel watched me make myself useful, and finally stepped between me and my next invented task. He set his horn beside my pack and left it there. Not touching, just pointing out the thing I was refusing to see. Rill joined up and we walked the long loop together at first light, just the three of us, and the sound of water remembering how to be kind. At the ridge where the wind stops biting, he stopped. Meaning arrived the way it always did with him, like heat from a fire. The grove did not need me to hover. It needed me to return. I understood. This wasn't my place. But it wasn't a permanent farewell. I proposed the following. Every 2 years, in all weathers, I would come by the crooked path with heartblush wine in hand, clean linen, and time enough to listen. Ezekiel lowered his head, and then with the smallest nod plucked a single strand from his tail and set it across the strap of my satchel. It lay there like a line on a map showing me where I was to return to. We marked the vow in a simple way. Rill planted 3 willow saplings along the washed bank, bordered with new stones. When I finally shouldered the satchel, it felt much lighter in supplies and heavier in obligation. I said my goodbyes and proceeded to exit the grove. At the last bend, I looked back. Ezekiel was already where he needed to be, standing with one forehoof on the firmest of the newly placed stones, head turned slightly as if listening to the water ask a question. I could have invented a few more chores to keep me back for just one more day, but I didn't. 2 years would pass regardless. The grove would keep the time, and I would keep the path. I continued on my way, collecting stories and recipes that I wouldn't have been able to if I stuck around in the grove. The months began to stack like neat bowls on a shelf, each with its own small flavor. Eventually, 24 of them had made a nice collection, and I made my way back to the grove to see my old buddy. On this visit, the willow cuttings we'd set had taken hold, green thumbs pushing into the bank where the dragon's sour had once chewed. Ezekiel met me at the bend, and we walked the water together, his hooves testing the stones we'd set 2 summers before. I left a bowl on the flat rock, tied a new bowstring, threaded with hairs from Ezekiel's mane, and gave it to Rill for his work in the woods. He was still an apprentice then, but a diligent worker compared to when I had met him 2 years prior. After a few weeks of communion and hard work, we wrote 2 lines in the ledger. The filter's held, and the saplings are strong. By my 4th visit, the bridge was wearing into the shape of the feet that crossed it. The village had a new poultice maker who hummed while she worked. I traded her a jar of owlbear tallow for a lesson in herbs that quiet fevers without dimming dreams. A late frost took the meadow's first flowers, and I learned to thicken broth with wild oat and marrow instead of counting on tender greens. Ezekiel watched me try to come up with reasons to overstay my welcome again, then flicked an ear toward the ridge where the wind breaks, and I acquiesced to go explore the world some more before our next visit. On my 8th visit, a nearby town's herbalist visited the conclave with questions and a full purse, though Ezekiel's grove never took payment in coin. He asked to learn the Dragonburn cordial properly, and wrote down our method as if it were a spell. After we were done teaching him, we brewed 2 small pots of clear water fertilizer, and I poured them back to the roots of one of the young willows which was beginning to struggle compared to its 2 siblings. Rill, bigger in the shoulders now, and quieter in the mouth, assisted his master in carrying the ledger, and inscribed a record of our work. 1 willow falters, but still holds strong. The 12th visit was a year of water. Storms bullied the ridge, and some small streams tried to remember how to be rivers. We reset stones with our shins in the current, learned where to let the bank breathe and where to bind it, and built a low sill that coaxed the hungry water to spread its temper into a marsh instead of gnawing one bank to the bone. I cooked in the rain under an awning of hide, ladling broth into hands that were chilled to the bone. Ezekiel came late to the bend after his own work deeper in the grove was complete, and shook himself like a dog right in my face. An undignified sight for a divine beast, and one that made me laugh heartily. Rill and I penned the year honestly in the ledger. The year of the drenched unicorn. By my 16th visit, the children who once wove garlands had children of their own. They brought me seeds from their gardens and asked for recipes their grandparents loved, which is how I learned that a place stays healthy when its favorites are simple enough for anyone to cook on a tired night. We retired the first bridge and set a new one with a gentler pitch so elders could cross without guessing which steps might slip out from under them. Ezekiel began taking the shade sooner and stayed there longer. He was still bright, but less steady and closer to silence. But I didn't think much of it, as I also felt my bones begin to creak in ways they hadn't when I was younger. On the 20th visit, poachers tested the edge of what people will do when meat gets scarce. It had been a rough year for many farmers in the area with torrential downpours and early frost which killed both crops and livestock. Rill, now the head warden, gathered the poachers so the conclave's feast would not shame them, but teach them. We walked the banks and the oak line and taught lean season craft instead of hunting. How to tell windfall from rot. How to leach bitter acorns and grind them with wild oat. How to spot the good, firm chanterelles and leave behind their ill-tempered twins. And how to read a carrion find so you only take what's safe. I cooked the haunch of a stag we found downed in a storm, basted with dew wine and thyme, and I told a story about shortcuts that ended in long winters. Ezekiel stood in the dusk at the far side of the bridge and let the children count the rings on his horn to distract them from the thunder. And we wrote the following in the ledger. 12 poachers turned foragers took their leave with thanks. By my 24th visit, I could feel our work in my bones the way weather knows old scars. I knew where the stream would push first if a tree fell, and which willow would want to be propped up after a hard freeze. Rill's hair had gone silver at the temples. The town herbalist sent students to the grove instead of coin, and the midwife tied a loop of mane above a crib that would mark her 100th delivery. That crib happened to be the crib of Rill's first granddaughter. Ezekiel still met me at the bend, but he arrived gently, unhurried, and with less intensity than in the previous years. We left 2 lines in the ledger that year that felt like a summation. The place remembers our work. So do we. And almost 25 meetings in, the cadence changed. Ezekiel took longer to rise, and longer still to walk the length of water we always walked. He paused more often to listen, not to me, but to the grove. And I began to understand what the next visit would ask of us. I did not write that in the ledger. Some truths don't need ink when the time would pass anyways. And that brings us to visit 26. I came to the grove by the same crooked path as always. Packed light with heart-blush wine and clean linen. Mind already counting the days I could stay before the road tugged at me again. Before I saw Ezekiel, I could read the thinning of his trail. The grass held fewer crescents. The stream glittered softly as if tired of being bright. The place had the careful tidiness you see in a kitchen at closing time. Everything put away, but the last pot still warm. He stepped from the shade, thinner than in my memory, and for the first time in all our years, he asked me not to plan my leaving. Stay, he said. Stay and help me feed them when I'm done. I answered him with a cook's confusion. Feed who? With what? And why me, of all people? I had always come to mend and then step aside. That was my role. He stood very still under the question until meaning arrived the way it did with him, steady as heat from a good fire. A funeral feast, he let me understand, is not a banquet of grief. It's a lesson set to the table so the living remember how to keep up a place in someone's absence. The first bowl teaches gratitude and goes to the roots. The first dish teaches restraint and goes first to the watchers who kept the vigil. The long simmer teaches patience and goes to those who do the slow work. The last silent dish teaches that love is quiet when it needs to be. He wanted the last of himself to be strength in other bodies, light in other hands, and tools that would outlast his own time. I told him I didn't know all the rites, and he answered that I knew how to listen, which is the most important part. He showed me in small flashes what should come. Clay and stone instead of iron, so the flavor of the grove would not dull. Moon tallow rendered gentle, so the elders could eat without the meat fighting them. A list kept organized as we worked, so every piece of him would already have a task before it left the cloth. Mane to hang over the cribs of the young, hide for rain cloaks that would shelter midwives and wardens, and his horn to be saved to heal any who needed help in the grove. Nothing wasted, nothing hoarded, nothing carried away to be forgotten or sold. I won't lie, the request knocked the breath out of me. I have butchered beasts and monsters, and once a serpent big enough to make a village's entire winter easy. But none of them ever looked at me with a friend's eyes and asked me to lay out the cloth. The word stay and the word butcher didn't belong in the same mouth. A refusal rose in me like a boil over, and I told him I couldn't bring myself to do it. Ezekiel didn't press. He only stood with one hoof on the stone I had set years ago, and the meaning came the way it always did with him, steady as heat from a good fire. This would not be killing. That part of the story was already told. He knew he only had a season left in him anyways. This was a question of what happened after his last breath. It would be a question of honoring him. We had dressed the grove for years so that it could go on living. Now we would dress his body so that the work could go on living in others. The knife wouldn't be a trophy maker, but a lantern, opening paths for gifts to travel. Strength to the watchers, patience to the slow workers, and shelter to those who carry children across bad weather. I understood now that to refuse would to be leaving the ledger unfinished. I was not agreeing to make meat of my old buddy, but I was agreeing to help him carry out his final wish for the grove. So, I put down my pack without counting the days left. I walked the length of water we always walked, this time naming the tasks out loud as if I was reading a recipe to the woods. I showed Real where I would lay the cloth, where the broth would simmer, where the garlands would wait after the small hands made them. I sorted my tools and set the iron aside. I cleaned the clay pots with mint and spring water and let them upside down dry in the sun. I wasn't sure when I would need these tools, but I was always one to err on the side of being early rather than late. That night, I made a small batch of fertilizer and poured the first ladle at the roots of the struggling willow tree that we had planted so many years ago, flanked by its two swaying siblings. Ezekiel watched from the edge of the shade, eyes the color of a sky trying to clear after rain, and I understood the shape of my part at last. I had come here years ago to keep water from biting. I would stay now to keep my old buddy company until his final day. We spent the night talking openly, and I asked him if he was scared. He told me that fear belongs to those who think a body is the only proof of their life. He wanted the conclave to remember the work he had shared. He wanted the grove to be strong so that even those who never met him would know what had been kept whole here. He wanted me to stand at the fire because my hands had learned the pace of this place and would no longer rush it. With this reassurance, I focused on making the most of each conversation we had left. The days wore on, and winter hung cold through the grove. Each day was spent talking and sipping on the same broth I had made for him so many years ago. And as the cold of winter began to thaw, the last days slowed to a crawl. We walked the water at first light and last. Not far, just enough to feel where the bank was tiring and would need reinforcement again by Real's pupils. We cleared windfall from the footpath, nudged a few errant branches out of the current, and listened for the places where the stream still remembered the old sour from half a century earlier and needed a gentler hand. When the apprentices flagged, I did what I always do. Set a small pot to a whisper, and passed around clear broth, oat cakes, and slices of dried apple. The food didn't fix the water, but it fixed the people fixing the water, and that had amounted to the same thing over the years. Rill showed his pupils how to read the shine of the surface with a dew lens, how to place a stepping stone where the stream wants it, not where the boot prefers, and how to tell the difference between a bank that needs binding and one that needs room to breathe. Ezekiel kept near without crowding, testing small mends with a forehoof, tipping his head toward Juniper when patience would do more than cleverness, and in the evenings, we kept the ledger updated with what the grove had asked and what we'd answered. Toward dusk, we sat on the ridge where the wind breaks and let the day settle. I told him where I'd cooked since the last visit. He always loved my stories, about stubborn sauces I'd finally learned to leave alone, about the shortcuts that had turned into long adventures, and about the cast of interesting characters I'd met in the past 2 years. He let me feel, gently, that leaving things alone is also a craft. When I asked him what he wanted me to remember most, the answer came simply. Keep the path. Keep the way open between this grove and the world so water and stories can keep flowing in both directions. On the last night of winter, I combed a few burrs from his mane and washed dust from his forelegs with minted water as if he'd come in from rain. Rill made quiet rounds to the elders. We banked the fire low and let the crickets take the watch. Sometime past midnight, Ezekiel came to stand beside my little camp and asked for my company. We listened to the babbling of the creek and the whisper of the willow, and the slow work of a place that had taken half a century to truly heal. As we thought back on the decades' worth of meeting and stories, he asked me something he had never asked me before. Would you like to know my true name? I was confused at first, but then remembered what he had said so many years ago. That Ezekiel was a name that the Grove's children had given him. Though, I guess he thought of all of us as the Grove's children. He looked me straight in the eyes, and in my mind I heard his name for the first time. It sounded like the first rain of spring falling onto parched earth. While I'm not able to pronounce it, it's a beautiful name. We continued talking late into the night, as if we were children who were both too eager to sleep. But as the hours waxed on and the fire reduced to ashes, I felt a chill come on the breeze, and we both felt a deep tiredness wash over us. I added some logs to the fire and stoked the coals. Then I laid my last clean cloth over his back, and we laid down to sleep. At first light, the grove woke before I did. The air held the hush I've only heard a few times in my life. Birds waited a beat before their first notes. I reached for the ledger, then for nothing. Ezekiel laid where he settled. Warm the way stones are warm just after the fire has gone out. Bright, but bright like a memory. His flank did not rise. I set my palm to his brow and said the only true thanks I know. Then I wept. The day that would ask everything of us had come. I left Ezekiel where he laid and called Rill to inform the conclave and begin the vigil. As I left Ezekiel in Rill's care, the grove received me with that soft, held breath hush that comes when a place is ready to listen. People arrived the way birds do after a storm, first in ones and twos, then in small, careful groups. No one hurried. Rill spoke a few plain words about beginnings tucked inside endings. I then began the funeral rites. I'll be honest, the entire process was a blur. Every action was performed with focused precision and intention, but it's hard for me to recollect each individual step. But even if it was difficult for me, it was necessary to carry out the wishes of one of my oldest friends. I carried out every last step with sweat on my brow, and then I called the village to begin the funeral feast. We ate as we told stories together. The elders spoke first, not because sorrow belongs to age, but because gratitude does. And apparently, according to them, I was one of the elders. One remembered the year the stream tried to become a river and how Ezekiel taught the druids how to calm and redirect it. Another told of the birth of a young rascal in the conclave and how sickly he was when he was born into the winter frost. The midwife tied a loop cut from Ezekiel's mane above the cradle, and the baby's breathing found its rhythm with the snow. The midwife herself only hummed and grasped Rill's hand tightly. It turns out that rascal was him. The bowls went round again. and the herbalist from the town reminisced on his first visit to the grove and how he had brought coin and left with a lesson instead. Ezekiel never accepted coin for knowledge, and instead believed it should be shared freely to those who were doing their best to help another. The herbalist then went on to speak of the dragon burn cordial, learned here and taught further on, and I chuckled at how a story can change in just a few decades. But the children told the best story of all, because it was short and exact, about how counting the rings on a hoard can make a long night a little less scary. There was laughter too. Someone told the year of the drenched unicorn story, and I admitted, as is only proper, that he chose the worst moment to shake himself dry. Rill teased me about teaching patience with soup to elders who already had it, and I countered by telling him he was the last person to lecture me about patience. The children tried out a song the herbalist students had brought from the city, a tune that turned out to be an old grove melody, wearing new boots. A tune that Ezekiel had commonly hummed as he made his rounds through the groves. When the bowls were light and the shadows long, the oaths began. Small, measurable, and spoken without flourish. One made an oath to keep a mile clear of snags. One made an oath to replant the willow cuttings on the bank after the thaw. One made an oath to make a watch over the ford on market days. One made an oath to keep a lesson taught to the next batch of young wardens in training. No one wrote their oaths down, because a good promise stands best on its own legs, and the grove is a better clerk than any of us when it comes to keeping score. Near dusk, the circle began to loosen. A last bowl moved hand to hand without a word, and each person held it for a count or two before passing it on. I thought of Ezekiel's head bent over a steaming cup the first day in the clearing, and of all the times I'd learned to listen before lifting a spoon. When the bowl returned to me, it was warm and almost empty. I tipped the little that remained to the ground where his hoof had once pressed a crescent in the grass, and the earth accepted it thankfully. And just like that, the feast was over. Stories finished where they started, voices settled into reverent whispers, ashes were patted into the earth so the wind wouldn't scatter them. The ledger closed, heavy not with debt but with direction. People left the way they came, in ones and twos, carrying nothing that would shine on a mantle and everything that would wear into usefulness. I stayed until the last cup was rinsed and turned upside down to dry, and then I poured the very last of the broth onto a sapling that Ezekiel had fallen asleep next to the night before. He truly cared for this grove above all else, and as I began to take my leave, I made my own oath. I would keep the path. Here's to you, Ezekiel. I hope you enjoyed. This story was a bit different in tone from many of my others, but as fun as monster hunting may often be, I believe that it's important to recognize the solemnity necessary to honor nature. As always, my content is completely free and available for download at my Ko-fi page, Eating the Dungeon. And let me know if you have any future requests as we close this chapter on unicorns.